name and title, please.
I'm Susan Glickman. I'm the Florida Director of Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
All right, great. Well, we're going to talk about the Public Service Commission today. First of all, the Florida Public Service Commission, what is it and who's part of it?
The Florida Public Service Commission, which operates out of the state capitol in Tallahassee, Florida, is one of those agencies that has a very big influence on our lives, and most people don't even know of its existence. So it regulates our utility companies. And it used to play a big role, and still does in some minor ways, in telecommunications. But as telecommunications became deregulated, a lot of that, those responsibilities have gone away. So they're primarily responsible for the big investor-owned utilities, the monopolies like Duke Energy and Tampa Electric Company, and the biggest utility in the state, Florida Power and Light, and Gulf Power up in the Panhandle. And then some of the smaller utilities, if they are going to build a new power plant like Jacksonville Electric Authority or the Orlando Utility Commission, they would have to come before the Public Service Commission. So they look at whether or not these utility companies need to build new power plants. Every 5 years, they are, by statute, required to set conservation goals for the state of Florida. And they also decide what's called cost recovery. So the utilities will come for environmental costs, and those costs will be approved by the Florida Public Service Commission. One of the real key elements that they have to look at is decide whether decisions by the utilities are considered prudent or not. That's a phrase, it's a term of art, but you hear it a lot at the Public Service Commission. So were those costs prudent to build this new power plant? Or is it prudent to build a new power plant instead of doing more conservation programs, for instance? So that is their job. The Florida Public Service Commission is essentially a creature of the Florida legislature. So it is governed by the legislature, it is funded by the Florida legislature. Members to the Florida Public Service Commission go through a nominating council that are largely made up of legislators as well. They will hone down a list of applicants. People apply to become public service commissioners. The salary is $131,000 annually, plus an enormous amount of benefits that you get with everything from health insurance to vacation and retirement and so forth. But people apply to be public service commissioners, and then they go through a nominating process with this nominating council. And then names are sent up to the governor, and the governor selects. So that's the process. So the investor-owned utilities, which are monopolies, and in Florida they cover about 75% of Florida is covered by these investor-owned utilities. Another maybe 13% or so are what's called municipal electric companies, and the city of Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando, and Lakeland, for example, have their own utilities. And then the rest of it are either rural electric cooperatives, really smaller communities that serve rural areas. So they have enormous clout, these big monopoly utility companies. So the biggest utility in the entire country is Duke Energy. It certainly serves this area in your listening region. And then up in the Panhandle we have Gulf Power, but they're owned by Southern Company. And Southern Company is the second biggest utility in the country. So you can add that to the biggest utility in the state of Florida, Florida Power and Light, and they have ginormous influence and outsized clout. So when it comes to the Florida Public Service Commission, you know, these regulators that are supposed to be operating in the public's interest, we see time and time again the influence of the utilities on that process.
And the group Integrity Florida released a report this year called Florida's Public Service Commission, and in this case public service is in quotes, and the subtitle is a captured regulatory agency. What do they mean?
So when it comes to regulatory agencies, the word captive is actually a term of art that's used and understood in the industry. And in this case it means captive to the utilities that they really are supposed to be regulating. So we see an enormous amount of influence at the Florida Public Service Commission And the Integrity Florida report looks at the decisions made by the Public Service Commission and is really assigning this idea to it that they are captive to the utilities. So they will essentially rubber stamp the utilities request. So a utility would come to the Public Service Commission and say, we need to build a new power plant, and they go into a process called the needs determination process. And there are very few instances where I've seen, and I have been involved at the Public Service Commission and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, the organization of which I'm the Florida director, with our in-house attorney who spends a lot of time at the Florida Public Service Commission. We have been engaged there for many, many years. And there are only a couple instances that I can think of ever where the regulators stood up to the utilities and came up with a decision that was in opposition to their request. And to give you just a little bit of history, when Charlie Crist, who's now a member of Congress, but when he was governor, he appointed more consumer-minded commissioners. He, as Attorney General, had really stood up to the utilities on rate increases before, and he carried, that philosophy all the way through. And those commissioners denied Florida Power and Light a rate increase. This was in 2009. And so those 4 commissioners that stood up to this big utility, very powerful utility, on their rate increase ended up essentially off the commission. So 2 of them were in line to be nominated. They were nominated, but they needed to be confirmed by the Senate. And they'd been selected by Governor Crist, and they were not confirmed by the Senate. And then 2 other of the commissioners, Nathan Scopp and Nancy Argenziano, who had served for at least a term, they were not nominated again by the nominating council. So those 4 commissioners went off, and ultimately FPL came in again for another rate increase where they were received more favorably. So it was interesting because one of the proceedings, and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy would suggest that one of the problems with energy policy in Florida is that we have a disjointed utility planning process. So most states do what's called integrated resource planning. And you put supply and you put demand on a level playing field. So you can meet utility demand with energy efficiency, and it's just a generally more consumer friendly, but certainly more clean energy friendly, to have a more robust utility planning process. But not in Florida. In Florida, we separate all the pieces. So you come and you ask to build a power plant in what's called a need determination. And so the utilities argue why they need all this new generation. And that's usually based on projections for growth. And what's happened in the utility industry is that demand has really flattened. It flattened in the sort of 2008-9 around the recession, and then things are just becoming more efficient. So one of the good news stories that I have is every time someone buys a new refrigerator, a new air conditioner, a new appliance, it's going to be more efficient. So we just are using less energy. And we could capture more of this efficiency. So one of the other sort of legs of the stool of the utility planning process in Florida is something by statute that the Public Service Commission does every 5 years, and it's called the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act. We call it FECA. So they do a FECA docket, and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy has been interveners both in the 2009 FECA docket and more recently in 2014. So I mentioned to you that Charlie Crist had appointed some more consumer-minded commissioners, and in 2009 they raised the conservation goals for the utilities a little bit, to 1/3%. I try not to overload people with too many numbers, but a little bit, suffice it to say. And the 2 biggest utilities in the state, once the goals were set, kept rescheduling when they would come forward to do their program plans. They rescheduled, rescheduled 3 or 4 times. And when that new commission got seated, that Governor Rick Scott appointed after the more consumer-minded members of the commission that Charlie Kristen appointed, the first thing they did was to set aside the penalties for not meeting your conservation goals for half the state. And fast forward 5 years later, in the 2014 proceeding, Florida Power and Light asked to reduce their already anemic conservation goals by 99%, and Duke Energy by 98%, and TECO by 87%. So essentially, in Florida, our conservation goal and energy efficiency efforts have been gutted. And that's because big monopoly utility companies make more money. They get a guaranteed range of a rate of return on whatever capital expenditures that they make. So that's why they want to build power plants, and they really don't want to help people be more efficient. So the role that the Florida Public Service Commission plays in all that is to approve whatever the utilities ask, generally speaking. And as I said, in the last more than a decade, there are only a couple instances where I have seen the Florida Public Service Commission not rubber stamp what the utilities' requests were.
Our guest is Susan Glickman, Florida Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Is that conservation standard that you're talking about, is that the same as the renewable portfolio standard that was trying to get pushed through several years ago?
Actually, they're different. In a sense, they would act similarly in that they would create a target or a goal for energy efficiency in the same way that a renewable portfolio sets a target for renewable energy. But in the state of Florida, we have neither a target for energy efficiency or for solar or renewables. So we haven't done very well in that front. The Florida Public Service Commission is a place where annually the utilities will report how many net metered solar customers they have, for instance.
What's net metering?
Yeah, net metering is where you put solar up on your house and you're connected to the grid. And our current net metering rule, which is a rule coming out of the Florida Public Service Commission, says that the utility will credit you a retail rate, which is the rate that you would pay each month up to the amount that you use. And at the end of the year, they're going to true that up, and then they're going to credit you more of a wholesale rate. So generally speaking, you're going to pay 11 cents a kilowatt hour, roughly. And that's what they're going to credit you each and every month. So you want to, most people will, size their solar systems in accordance with what they're likely to use. So you're going to look at your old electric bills and you'll size the system accordingly. Because if you generate more energy than you use, you're only going to get credited a wholesale rate, which could be 2 cents a kilowatt hour. It's obviously a much lower number, so there is no incentive on generating more than you use. But you can get a retail rate for up to what you use. So that's the net metering rule. That's a good example of something the Florida Public Service Commission does. But in the latest reporting for how many systems we have net metered, and that could be a residence, or it could even be a business, it's under 16,000 for the entire state of Florida, where you have a potential, let's say, 10 million electricity customers around the state. So it's less than 1%. In fact, right now, in the state of Florida, we're only getting about 1/3 of 1% of our needs met with solar. There are a lot of big commitments, and I'm happy to tell you that Duke Energy is going to add 700 megawatts of solar, and Tampa Electric is going to add 600 megawatts, and that's great. But we still have a long way to go to get to any sort of meaningful critical mass of solar in the state. So we need to continue to encourage. And I do always like to make sure we give good news. And the good news is the cost of solar has come down so exponentially that it really is cheaper than building a new natural gas plant, for instance. So it's exciting to see the cost coming down that's really allowing solar to take off. We've had an increase at 110% of residential solar permits just in the last year. And my hat's off to my friends at the League of Women Voters that started a group called Solar United Neighbors. and they create a co-op for solar residential. And people join the co-op for free, and they get advantage of knowing that the vendor that the co-op selects is vetted, and you also get about a 20% reduced price because they're doing some volume discount buying when they put out a request for proposal. And I'm also helping to develop a commercial solar collaborative, because really most people don't realize at what a great economic case there is for solar right now. I myself just got solar installed on my home. It's 10.5 kilowatts, and I'm told it's going to be about a 4.5-year payback. So just think about that. My system's a pretty big one, and it's almost $20,000, but you get a 30% federal tax increase. So, and again, you do either come out of pocket for that or you have to finance that, and I can speak to that in a minute. But, the system ends up being about $14,000, and based on electric bills that I would have of $250 a month, before, about 4.5 years into it, I will have paid off that equipment. And then you get 24 years of free electricity. So the economics are there. One of the other good news aspects of this is that financing is becoming available. The city of St. Petersburg just signed an arrangement with a nonprofit called the Solar Energy Loan Fund, and they offer loans to people not only for solar, but their sweet spot is really energy efficiency, which could be a new roof, it could be a new air conditioner. One of the things that utilities have over us, over consumers, and it's one of the roles that the Florida Public Service Commission plays, is that if they want to build a new power plant, they just build it, and then they put the cost for it in your rate base, and you pay for it. And you're financing their new power plant, essentially. So what financing does is it just allows everyone to get a car, just like you would get a car, right? You're going to finance it. Some people buy cars with cash, but most people don't. Most people lease a car, or they go to their bank and they finance it in some way. And that's what's opening up a door. So the Solar Energy Loan Fund, we call itself, is going to be working in the area. So if anybody out there needs a new air conditioner and they need to finance it, and you don't have those upfront costs, I would look up Solar Energy Loan Fund, and they've just hired a staffer, and that's going to be located in St. Pete, but they can operate in the whole area. So it's we have a real daunting problem about moving to clean energy and ultimately reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and all that means to a place like Florida and Tampa Bay with the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. But the good news is between the cost of solar coming down and the electrification of transportation and the financing, I really think we can meet this challenge because we have the technology. So that's why we need the Florida Public Service Commission and the regulatory agencies and, our legislators and all of our elected officials, to get on board. It was 250 years ago when Ben Franklin said an ounce of prevention, is worth a pound of cure. And that's one of these issues. So we need to get out in front of these problems and figure out how we're going to move to clean energy that's going to allow us to be more sustainable into the future.
Our guest is Susan Glickman, Florida Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. You're listening to Midpoint on WMNF 88.5 FM and WMNF.org. So talking about the Florida Public Service Commission today, why is it so politicized? What is it about that agency that makes it so indebted to the electricity industry?
Well, because the Florida legislature directs the Florida Public Service Commission, because the Florida legislature has a nominating council that actually picks who the nominees will be, and then those names go up to the governor, the influence of the money in politics that the big monopoly utility companies put into campaigns, they have just an enormous influence, and that's why the Integrity Florida report, refers to the Florida Public Service Commission as being a captive agency. There's a lot of money at stake, and I'll just give you an example. When I spoke about the public utility commissioners who stood up to Florida Power and Light on their rate increase, In the most recent rate increase for the biggest utility in the state, they got $811 million, and that money goes right into the rate base. And remember, they're getting a guaranteed rate of return. In Florida Power and Light's case, it can be up to an 11.5%, and it's a guaranteed rate of return. So who gets those kind of returns on your investment? Not very many people. So it's just very simple. There's a lot of money at stake. And frankly, the public service commissioners and commission staff, there is a long history of a revolving door where they actually go and work for the utilities. It was several years ago, but the Sun Sentinel down in the Fort Lauderdale area had done a piece, and they identified 24 former public service commissioners and commission staff that were actually on the payroll of Florida Power and Light. And we see that a lot. A lot of the lobbyists and a lot of the people that represent the utilities have worked at the Public Service Commission. We also get a lot of former lawmakers that work for the utilities. They'll come out and they'll go on to the utility staff. The Integrity Florida in early 2012 did a report called Power Play. And Power Play was all about the money that the four big investor-owned utilities were contributing to the political process. The Integrity Florida is in the process of updating that report, and you'll hear more about the 2014 and 2016 elections. But in this 5-year period that they examined, the utilities gave $18 million to state legislative races. They spent another $12 million hiring lobbyists. And they spent another $16.5 million that went to the two political parties. And for those listeners who were paying attention in the elections, where in November of 2016, the utilities ran an initiative called Amendment 1, and it was widely exposed as sounding like it was good for solar when it wasn't, and that got a lot of attention. The utilities spent almost $30 million that was reported, that we know about. There was a lot of legal fees that go into the Supreme Court case. The utilities pay for those separately. So the $27 million reported to the elections office isn't all the money that was spent, but it's a lot of money. So there's a lot of money at stake, and every time they put up transmission lines and build power plants, they make more money. And so it's really a very simplistic way, and I think people on the political right and the political left understand this sort of sweetheart deal that goes on. And it's unfortunate that sometimes we're paying for things we don't need. We do pay sometimes for power plants that get cited that we don't need when we could meet that need with more cost-effective energy efficiency. Florida sends about $50 billion a year out of state each and every year to bring in fuel from elsewhere, because we don't have coal in Florida, we don't have natural gas in Florida, and they're not the only ones. The Florida Cabinet approved a 515-mile natural gas pipeline that Duke is invested in, as well as Florida Power and Light's parent company called NextEra, along with Spectra Energy, and this was widely covered before the 2014 election. Governor Rick Scott has an investment in Spectra Energy, and as a member of the Florida Cabinet, he voted to approve the pipeline. Now, everyone always says, well, how can that be? That investment is in his, what they call a blind trust, a so-called blind trust. I don't know how you would be that blind, but so you can just see this web of interactions between the government and the people that are there to protect us and to represent consumers' interests, and the influence of these big monopoly utilities that make just almost unthinkable amounts of money that runs through the commission. One example that I'll give you recently is Florida Power and Light filed for $1.3 billion. So by contrast, I mentioned a rate increase, and it's roughly what they do about every 3 years, of $811 million. Right after the rate increase, they came in with a request for costs for Hurricane Matthew. That was another $311 million. And now Florida Power and Light just filed for $1.3 billion in cost recovery to pay for the costs associated with Hurricane Irma. So we are talking about enormous amounts of money. So the Florida Public Service Commission is going to decide whether Florida Power and Light spent all those costs prudently. You know, we really need a more sort of independent body looking at this, because we need to examine, should we be building microgrids, and you know, does this old style transmission lines, and there is a considerable transmission line loss when you have a power plant located far away and you run the power into, for instance, more populated urban territories. So we've got to really look at this with a fresh face, and you know, the interests of the consumers and the public may not always line up with the interest of the utilities.
Who are the people currently serving on the commission, on the Florida Public Service Commission?
Well, we've actually just added 2 new people to the Public Service Commission, so there has been some recent turnover. And in fact, one of the commissioners that was just very recently appointed to the commission by Governor Rick Scott is a former legislator named Rich Workman, and he has just pulled himself out. He was appointed to the commission, but awaiting Senate confirmation. He's replacing a gentleman named Ron Brise, who's down from South Florida. Ron Brise has been on the commission for a while. He was a former legislator, and he was not selected. Instead, Rich Workman was selected, but he's had to pull himself out of the running because one of the state senators who actually chairs the Rules Committee has accused him of some essentially vulgar behavior at a charity event that they were at, and she announced very recently that she would not schedule a hearing for him.